Good morning, everyone, and welcome to On the Line with AgriLife. Really quickly want to ask and remind you to put in the chat what county you might be joining us from. And if you have any questions throughout the program, please let us know. And with that, using the chat feature, with that, I'll let Sammy take it over.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our November On the Line with AgriLife. Just a quick reminder to please keep your devices muted. At the end of the program, we will have a Q&A and we will allow y'all to unmute. I would like to introduce the team who's responsible for putting this program on. We have myself, Sammy Lindsay from Crane County, Emily Grant Valverde, Matlin Sane Presidio, Jessica McCrory, Terrell County, Cody Trimble, Glasscock County, Dakota Kempkin, Glasscock County, Tanner Hash, Martin County, and Peyton Kiefer, Pecos County. And then Jessica is going to give us a reminder on the Remind app and how you can join and get reminds from there.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. This is Jessica McCrory, and I'm glad y'all were able to join us. I'm just going to quickly talk about our On the Line with AgriLife Remind text message group. The Remind will send out messages and reminders about the upcoming programs each month, including next year's, and have links to the survey at the conclusion of each. Signing up for the messages is easy to do and completely voluntary. Just start a new text message to the number 81010. In the message, type the @ symbol followed by the letters OTLWA, the initial letters of each word, and On the Line with AgriLife. Once more, message to 81010, and in the message @OTLWA. We hope you join our Remind text message group, and thanks again for joining our call today.
Thank you, Jessica. Today, our program, Dr. Joe Paschal is going to join us, and he's going to be discussing the proper ways for supplementing feeding with the common species produced in our areas. Dr. Joe Paschal is an extension livestock specialist in Corpus Christi and works with county extension agents primarily in the Edwards Plateau, South Texas, and the Gulf Coast to assist ranchers and livestock producers in management. He has been in extension since 1986, where he started as a livestock specialist in Fort Stockton. And without further ado, Dr. Paschal, are you ready?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Are you going to run the slides for me?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Okay, well, either I can do whatever you prefer.
You got it, Emily?
Yep.
Okay.
Whatever y'all want to do is okay with me.
Okay, Emily's going to do it for you.
All right, that'll be fine.
Let's double check.
Well, while we're getting around to that, I just wanted to wish everybody good morning. And it's a balmy 55 degrees down here in Corpus Christi, and I appreciate not having to drive to Crane, Texas for the meeting. I spent a couple of years, almost a little bit over 2 years, out in Fort Stockton as an extension livestock specialist back in '86. And really enjoyed the country, the people. It was really different for me, but I'm sort of back home down here in South Texas. And got down here in '88, and so you can see I never really have left, have any desire to be anyplace else. So I'm glad to be here this morning, and thanks to Sammy and the rest of the crew for inviting me here today. Go ahead and advance, Emily, if you're doing that.
Okay, we're good to go.
Yeah, okay, go ahead and advance if you don't mind. So I see Reed Reddin's on here, and when I was visiting with Sammy, and she asked me to do this, I told her it'd been quite a while since I had conducted many supplementation talks about sheep and goats, and Reed at San Angelo with the research station there is also the acting resident director, is the expert. And of course you have Bruce Carpenter, Dr. Bruce Carpenter, as your extension livestock specialist in Fort Stockton. So they would certainly be the go-to people for your particular part of the world. But you know, I borrowed some publications from a good friend of mine, Dr. Rick Machin. Rick was at Fort Stockton for a while, then moved to Uvalde, and now he is at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management in Kingsville. And he had put a couple of really nice publications that I sent to Sammy, one on supplemental feeding of goats and another one on sheep. And then I took a publication from Oklahoma State University that talks about winter supplementation of beef cattle by David Lehman. And I selected that rather than one of ours because I feel that your part of the world is a lot more similar to Oklahoma than it is to South Texas. So just some need to knows of supplemental feeding. And I know this might seem trivia, but you never know who's on these programs. You might have somebody that has a lifetime of experience and somebody else that's just starting to come on. You know, livestock species are different, and how we supplement them will be different. And even the feeds that we feed these animals can be different. So, for example, there may be a goat feed that's high in copper that should not be fed to sheep because of the possibility of toxicity. And so it's important to know, you know, livestock species, what are their requirements? Obviously, what are they, young animals? Are they stockers? Are they pairs? Are they cow-calf operation? You know, what physiological stage are they in? And then, of course, this seems obvious this time of year, but what's the quality or quantity of the range or pasture that you have? Y'all likely already had a frost up in that part of the world, or we're still not having one, likely will not have one until late January. So our grass is still growing, it's still green. But you know, as you get that first frost, the crude protein starts to drop considerably, well below the requirements of even a dry weather or a dry cow. And so as a result, the forage intake starts to decline. Nutrient requirements are not met, and so you start seeing a reduction in productivity. But also by forage species. So most of the time we're dealing with warm season perennial grasses on rangelands or pastures, but there are also cool season perennials that may be out there. Then what's the nutritive value of feedstuffs that you're going to supplement with? And I sure enough like the concept that we're actually supplementing, not substituting. We're not actually trying to feed these animals. That's a different talk. Typically, when we talk about supplementation, we talk about less than 1% of their total intake as a supplement. And then you need to know what the nutritive values of the different feedstuffs are. So oil seeds, and so oil seeds would be like one of my favorites, cottonseed, but it would include soybean, could include peanuts if you have access to it. What are the grains that are out? Very high in energy, typically. So oil seeds are high in protein, they're high in oil. Typically, they make a much higher energy product because of the oil or the fat that's in them. Grains generally are relatively low in protein, say around 8 to 12%, but they are very high in energy. Then what about processed feeds? So those would be sack feeds. It could be blended or textured or cubes or pellets. And then, of course, hay. And hay is pretty expensive in a lot of places if you have to haul it very far. And then you have to decide when to begin and end supplementation. And so that's an important point. When do you begin and end supplementation? When it gets dry, after your first frost, when the cows get thin, maybe when you start to run out of forage. And so those are important considerations. Go ahead, please. There we go. And so this, again, it seems like it's very trivial to talk about livestock species, but it's important to realize that that sheep and goats tend to have a much higher nutrient requirement than cattle do. And of course, we already talked about physiological stage. When I said lower intakes, I didn't mean that they had lower intakes per se, because they actually require more as a percentage of their body weight. So typically we think about intakes of cattle being around 2 to 2.5%. Sheep and goats can have 3 to 3.5, even 4% at times. And so it's important to realize that even though they're smaller animals, as a percentage of their body weight, they may actually require more feed. And the supplements tend to be a little bit more dense. Not a lot more dense, but typically more dense than we see with cattle. So I took my last nutrition course that I took was over 40 years ago. And so I'm sort of running off a lot of cowboy nutrition. We run cows down here. And when I was a kid, we ran goats. They were not the same kind of goats that we see in West Texas or in the Edwards Plateau. But, we think about requirements typically are much higher for younger animals because they're growing and developing, and that's important. But what about animals that have twins? And so small ruminants are very prolific and typically have twins. So that essentially doubles the nutrient requirements for those lactating ewes and lactating nannies if they have twins or even triplets. And so I've broken out my supplementation talk to be that essentially young livestock are similar to lactating females in all species. And that's not a perfect example, but it's pretty close. And then requirements for open and early bred females, if they are not lactating, okay, are similar to mature males. So the mature males in any species. And that sort of allows you to make some decisions instead of having 4 or 5 or 6 different categories to try to supplement. You can basically take your young animals and your lactating animals and put them in one group, and have your mature animals and your non-lactating females in another. Go ahead. Oops, I think we need to back up one maybe. Okay, so understanding nutritive value of forage, and this is actually taken down in in southern Kennedy County below Kingsville. That's actually sand underneath all that grass. And so everybody knows that cattle and sheep are grazers and have similar intakes and requirements from that standpoint. Goats tend to be browsers. We have a lot of browsers in South Texas. Okay, they happen to be white-tailed deer, and so they wouldn't like this pasture very much. And of course, then goats wouldn't either unless they could get to that live oak motte in the background. But one thing I want to point out is that as we think about nutritive value of forage right now, if it's dry or if you already had your first frost, it's basically just standing energy. There's very little protein in it. And so when we talk about supplementation most of the time, we're going to talk about protein supplementation rather than energy supplementation. However, if you're short of grass, then you have to think about energy supplementation as well. I can tell you that during the drought of 2011, 2012 down here, I basically pinned my cows up into a 5-acre pasture, or a trap actually, and then fed those animals for 144 days. I didn't allow them to go all over the pastures of the other 400 acres. I made them stay there, fed them out of troughs. And after 144 days, it had already been raining. It started raining about 60 days prior to that, and then turned them out. Save the cows, save the calves, and also, more importantly, save the pasture. So those are things to think about. Go ahead. So we talked about knowing the nutritive value, protein versus energy. Now, there are a lot of feeds out there that are combination feeds. So a lot of your textured feeds, your blended feeds, even pellets, some pellets will have a combination of protein and energy. And that may be actually the best thing to use if you're a little bit short of grass or forage. Your cattle or your livestock are in good body condition, and they are not lactating. However, if you have lots of dry forage out there, they're short of protein, and so that's what we consider over on the left-hand side. We already talked about oil seeds. One thing I want to point out is that a lot of those oil seeds can be high in vitamin A, and so as it starts to get dry and the grass gets brown, vitamin A is a fat-soluble vitamin. It's involved in reproduction, and so it may be important to supplement. We can supplement it in feeds. Sometimes we can supplement it in minerals, but most often we might supplement it with an injection. So young tender grasses and forbs and browses tend to be the highest, even during the dead of winter down here. A lot of our brush, a lot of the browse is pretty high in protein, which is why white-tailed deer and goats like it. We talk about supplementation. If it's deficient, improves forage supplementation with crude protein. Okay, with protein. If it's deficient in the forage, will improve forage digestibility. The ranges that I've seen of around 10 to maybe as high as 20 or 25%. And so essentially it's because of what we're feeding the animal. Forage is dry. Bugs in a rumen, regardless of whether we're talking about the small ruminants or the large one, they're deficient in nitrogen. They need nitrogen in order to manufacture protein to make more bugs, because that's what those ruminants are actually digesting, are the bugs. If deficient, typically we can look at fecal material. So fecal material will be hard. In the cattle feces, there'll be less water, more undigested fiber. There you can actually look at goat and sheep feces and pick up the pellets and squeeze them. There's actually a Brazilian graduate student in range management that did that work almost 30 years ago that actually related fecal material hardness back to lower diet quality. The nice thing about feeding protein, and this was actually done at the San Angelo Experiment Station and also at Oklahoma State, and they found that you can actually feed protein 2, 3, 4, or more times per week, even up to 7 times per week. Of course, the entire amount, 2 days worth every other day, 3 days worth every third day, with similar results. The problem with that is, of course, is that if you've got some bigger animals, or in the case of cattle, if you've got some horned animals, they tend to get their share. Energy I put up here except for oats, for grains, and the reason why, I mean, oats are high in energy. It's just that sometimes we have to compete with the horse industry for those, so they tend to be a little bit higher. They actually are the highest grain in terms of protein, but we have to compete with the horse industry for the price, for the value of it. But they're high in carbohydrates, starches, and sugars, which all supply energy. Highest in dry grasses and forage. If we supplement with energy, and I know that goat folks like to use corn, if you get to be too high, you start to reduce digestibility of forages that are out there, because the bugs in a rumen prefer to eat the carbohydrates in the grain as opposed to digesting the forage. If it's deficient, okay, if you're deficient in fatness, if you're deficient in energy, just like we talked about in crude protein, fatness or body condition starts to decrease. And to be real honest with you, grazing times lengthen, okay? Grazing and browsing times lengthen. So pay attention to your cattle and your sheep and goats as they graze or browse during the day. And so typically we feed energy, unless we're going to substitute it and feed it like in a feed yard. We need to feed energy in small amounts daily. Go ahead. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next 3 slides, which basically Sammy and the agents will send these out to you. But this is just, I just pulled up 3 fact sheets. So this happens to be one from Oklahoma State University. This is layman's, and you can pick it up at facts.okstate.edu. Supplementing beef cows. And this is actually an example of what you could use to supplement beef cows. It's a cookbook, okay? So HP stands for high protein. That would be something that would be in the neighborhood of 40% protein. It could be a cube. Cottonseed cube, it could be a molasses block or lick, providing they could get 2 to 3 pounds of it, ingest 2 to 3 pounds of it per day. An MP is sort of a medium protein product, sort of like a range cube. The beauty of this particular thing is that if you look under spring calving cows, which most of us will have, marginal cow condition, so that would be about a body condition score 4. You can see a last couple of ribs, and or severe weather. You can see that 5 pounds of medium protein cubes or 6 pounds of medium protein cubes, that could be quite expensive. The beauty of this is that you can basically cut that in half, so 2.5 or 3 pounds, and you might want to draw an error down there. You could actually use high protein cubes in the same way. And so you need to look at what it actually costs you to do some of these. What's the actual cost per pound of protein, as well as your ability to get out there and check your cattle all this time. So we have on the left-hand side, spring calving cows, on the right-hand side, fall calving cows, and then we have 2 columns under each with cows in good condition. That's a body condition score 5 or better, and moderate weather, sort of like what we're having up down here today. If you've got thin cows, that would be marginal cows and or severe weather. So that kind of gives you a cookbook. Go ahead and go to the next one if you don't mind. So the next one, as I recall, is for sheep, and this actually comes from the Rick Machen's work that will be sent out to y'all. And I won't want to belabor it. It's not really a cookbook, but it does give you an indication of the different classes of sheep and the different physiological states, and how things like total protein and energy vary, but in these as a percent of body weight. So you can pick this up by going to, and believe it or not, at beef.tamu.edu, looking under livestock species, going to sheep and goats and publications. So But that's just an easy way to remember our animal science website, beef.pamu.edu. And Reed may actually have some others that he would recommend. Go ahead and go to the next one. I think we have about 2 more to go. So this is for goats, and this again is from Rick Machen, and it just basically what the point here was is to what does it actually cost you to supplement some of these products per head per day, and to meet the nutrient requirement. Of course, this is we're looking at substitution rather than just supplement. Go ahead and go to the next one. Okay, so some parting thoughts. Some of these are my cattle. Good pasture management can reduce supplementation costs, and that's what I like to harp on when I visit with producers is rotational grazing or continuous grazing at the proper stocking rate. I realize that the Yamanet have buffalo grass pastures like I have there, but I remember what the country looks like out there, and it'd be so good. It's very, very important with the rainfall that you get that you don't harm the forage base. Okay. Reducing supplementation costs, running a cow, running a sheep or goat, about 1/3 of your cost is in nutrition. And I think that that's something that we need to worry about maintaining. It's cheaper to maintain body condition than it is to replace. So fatness on a cow or a ewe or a nanny, okay, it's cheaper to maintain it than it is to replace it, particularly if they start to get low. We all know that low body condition scores on any livestock species reduce reproductive function. Price your nutrients on the cost fed or delivered to the animal. Okay, what does it cost to get it to the animal per pound of protein or per pound of energy? Feed by weight per head, not volume. So I know a lot of sheep and a lot of goat producers down here, small goat producers, primarily Boer, Mexican, Spanish goats. They take a coffee can out there, and Rick makes a really good point that a coffee can of corn and a coffee can of whole shell corn and a coffee can of pellets, they're vastly different weights. So feed your animals or supplement your animals by weight. I know this is difficult to do if you've got a lot of country to cover. And I remember being out at Fort Stockton, the guys were measuring their stocking rates on a number of animal units per section. But if you can, don't feed on the ground. Okay. You probably lose 10 to 20% of your feed by feeding on the ground. I realize that troughs are expensive, but I have some troughs that I've had now for 15 years. I drag them around from pasture to pasture and from place to place. And if you've got a small enough number of animals, that might be something to consider. It keeps them from eating dirt, causing mineral imbalance, as well as ingestion of bacterial spores that are in the ground. And then finally, maintain a good, clean water supply. Sometimes that's not easy to do. Put out white salt and a good balanced mineral. Make sure that you don't put out a cattle mineral to sheep because it could be high in copper. And then of course, look at vitamins and minerals as needed. So I'm going to stop right there. I think I spent about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. I apologize, but if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. And I want to thank the agents for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Joe. We're going to open the floor for any questions. Anybody have a question out there?
I do out here, Emily Grant in Valverde County, and I'm just going to kind of ask in general, and especially since Reed is on, kind of tie him into this. I thought you made a really great point about maintaining that body condition, and that it's harder to make up that body condition once we've lost it. As we look at and evaluate our body condition scores in terms, and we notice that they are low, do you guys have any recommendation, maybe sheep and goats and on the cattle side, how we improve that? Especially since we are in a drought, our forage quality here is definitely low right now. How do we improve that affordably-ish? Because we all know it's not going to happen perfectly. Affordably-ish. And maybe is there a best method? Is that to come up and feedlot those animals and have a high concentrate diet versus supplementing in the pasture, trying to get that body condition up slowly.
Reed, you want to answer that?
I was just here to learn. You're the speaker.
Well, from the cattle side, Emily, if you try to supplement a high energy diet, a high energy supplement to any livestock, doesn't make any difference whether it's large or small ruminants. So what happens is you create a shift in the rumen, and this is 40-year-old knowledge, but you make it a little bit more acidic, and you promote the growth of bacteria, fungi, and protozoa that are more interested in eating corn than in digesting forage. And so if your cattle are in really poor body condition, let's say that or let's just say they're a body condition score 3, or Reed, I guess that would be like a 1.5 in sheep and goats. Y'all use it. I think y'all use a different system. Where you can see more than just the last couple of the ribs, it would almost be beneficial to bring those livestock into a pen and feed them, okay? Because it'd be more beneficial, I think. But again, then it's a ration. It's not a supplement. If your animals are out on pasture and you start to see the last couple of ribs starting to show, then doing a couple of things like adding a little bit of protein to their feed. If you have plenty of grass, plenty of dry grass, that'll improve the digestibility and unlock some carbohydrates. If grass is short, as you were talking about, then maybe a combination feed. But remember, if you start to feed it at greater than about 0.5%, well, let's just say less than 1% to 0.5% of their body weight, then at that point, above that, you start to get substitution. And so, it's no longer a supplement. So it really sort of depends on where your livestock are in terms of body condition. Now, right now, and I apologize because my familiarity with what goes on in the small ruminants at this time of year is limited. But for example, if you're spring calving cows, you're in 5-6 months of gestation, so nutrient requirements are relatively low. So in terms of any livestock species, if they're sort of in mid-gestation right now, nutrient requirements will be low. If they're lactating, they're going to be extremely high. It's going to be hard to put weight on a lactating anything that's already thin. At that point, it's basically put them into a pen and try to develop, because she's not going to breed. I don't care what she is. I don't care if she's a white-tailed deer. If she's lactating and she's thin, she's not going to breed up, and that's true of all livestock. So at that point, I would bring those animals in and basically just feed them. I think that would be most economical, but I mean, that's just my opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe. I appreciate it. I think that's the hard line and the fine line, especially for producers here in Valverde County, especially, is how that economic cost of feeding when we're in, our range and pasture conditions aren't the greatest, and we haven't had great rains as we head into the spring, making sure especially our sheep and goats are in the correct body condition to carry out those lambs and raise those lambs in the spring. So thanks so much. Great answer.
Yeah, body condition, to me, that's one of the things that, regardless of what sort of livestock you produce, that's the key, because animals that are in good body condition at birthing, let's just call it that, calving, lambing, kidding, they're going to, those females are going to have an easier time at parturition. They're going to provide better and higher quality colostrum. Their reproductive tract is going to go through the process of what I call reinvolution. I find that it's actually called involution, and they'll come back into heat more quickly and likely breed and successfully carry the next pregnancies to term. And that's all because of body condition. And so I think that's really critical. The problem is that body condition changes slowly. Maybe it takes a month in small ruminants. It may take 3 months to change body condition in large ruminants. So that's where it comes back to going back and watching the grazing habits, monitoring your pastures, and also this fecal analysis. I know we laugh about cow pies and pellets, but it's a real thing. You can actually get an indication of what's going on nutritionally in terms of diet quality, what the animals are actually eating by looking at their feces. And I think that's something we need to spend more time talking about.
Thanks so much, Dr. Joe. Again, loved hearing about cow poop and sheep poop. Reed, do you have anything to add on the sheep and goat side or does anybody else have any other questions before we wrap up this edition of On the Line with AgriLife?
Hey, Emily, this is Reed. I mean, I guess it's probably you don't have enough time to really go into a huge debate, but I differ that sheep and goats are not cattle, and that our supplementations and things are a lot different. I spent too much time in the upper Midwest where corn is really cheap and learned how to feed grains successfully. And I think a lot of times when we're supplementing sheep and goats, in beef cattle world, we don't want substitution. We want them to eat as much of that dead grass, but the sheep and goats aren't going to eat that dead grass anyways. And so, and most of the time when we need to, we're short on it. So substitution is really your friend because they're putting less pressure out there in the pastures. And so, I'm a proponent of feeding grains if you can buy them cost effectively, even if they reduce your diet digestibility by 10%. If you can get them purchased at half the price, you're money ahead and you're probably doing the best for the animals in the pastures. But that takes some time to get that figured out and the digestibility of those and not causing acidosis and things of that such. But sheep and goats are a different beast.
No, I completely agree. And I love the debate, and that's what On the Life is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be an open forum where our producers can ask questions with our specialists on the line. So if anyone has a question, but I think Reed makes a tremendous point. Up in the Midwest, where feed sources are so much more cost effective, that substitution that he talks about in the sheep and goat world is a lot different. And Reed, I'll tell you, from my perspective here in Valverde County, is those feed costs. The feed cost to feed a ewe here in Valverde County is much different than that in the Midwest. And I think that sometimes that feed cost can be a little shocking and scary to our producers. But I think it's an important thing to talk about. So does anybody else on the line have any questions before we wrap it up and introduce next month's topic? Feel free to unmute yourself. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. We want to remind you to join us for next month's On the Line on December 15th at 8:30. At 8:30 a.m., we will be doing a 2020 Ag Law Year in Review. So everything that has happened in the Ag Law with Ag Law in 2020, our Ag Law specialist, Tiffany Dowell-Lashment, will be here to talk about and tell you what you need to know and how that can impact you in 2021. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see y'all on December 15th at 8:30. Have a great week.